So welcome back. I hope that the inputs into health policy were interesting and stimulating, and I think Solomon has already said that seeing the intricate connections across policies and systems is very important, because a lot of the research that we're doing in HPSR is looking at the failure actually, or the gaps in terms of implementation of policies, or policies that are somehow at a mismatch in terms of actually addressing what the system needs. So I just wanted to say that I've looked at your research questions, and I'll shortly be sending some feedback. And what I found very, very interesting is that the conceptual frameworks, so some of you took a bit longer to get to your conceptual frameworks than others, and some of you were very fast in terms of grasping what had to be done. So those who were fast with grasping what had to be done weren't necessarily as strong on the questions, whereas those who took a long time to do the conceptual framework were actually a little bit stronger on the questions. So I'm not shedding any light on overall performance. Overall was very, very good. Okay, so you'll see that there's very, very few red boxes, in fact, and I wouldn't worry too much about them, but I thought it was interesting because it was different than what I expected. So that was interesting. All right. Okay, so now we're going to move to a fairly practical session in some ways, and we're going to be doing a little exercise just to support this stage that you're at. Okay, so we've now moved into the questions of how you look at policies, policy documents, and how you conduct policy analysis. And I have to say that I'm not a policy person. I'm not a health policy person. I'm much more a systems person. So my interest has always been at the interactions that take place in the system. Even though I recognize that a lot of my work is concerned with understanding how systems implement or don't implement certain initiatives. But people who are strictly policy analysts are operating at a kind of different level. They are operating at that macro structural level in terms of understanding kind of very broad level questions around how do things get onto the agenda, yeah? How are policies formulated? As I think Solomon showed you, the policy cycle, how are they implemented? And what is the post-policy phase? And that's something I have experienced, certainly in my career, in different places, but most recently probably in South Africa, where we were looking at the extent to which a policy on decentralizing care for people with multi-drug resistant TB was being decentralized down to the district level. And we were looking at the variability across the country because there were no really strong guidelines for implementation. So the policy came in, but people kind of had to figure out how to do it themselves. And so we looked at 3 provinces, and we were trying to understand how actually providers and managers cope up with that situation where they don't have very clear guidelines, or rather they might have some guidelines, but given their specific circumstances or constraints, they may find it more or less challenging to implement them in the way that was intended. Okay, so it was an evaluative study, but it was using a realist approach. But what I was most interested in is to look at what I would call adaptive responses. So the frontline providers, how were they going out of their way to try to provide decentralized care? And we wrote up a paper, which I'll share with you, which is all about these adaptive responses in policy implementation. So we're going to look at document mapping and review. That's not super exciting because you probably do it on a routine basis anyway. This is probably one of the methods you're most familiar with because it's the most intuitive in some ways. We all, in the course of our studies, we look at different kinds of documents. Usually we're looking at published literature, but maybe a smaller number of us are looking also at other types of documents, okay? So when I say other types of documents, with respect to health policy and systems research, what do I mean? What other types of documents are worth looking at? Guidelines, yeah, what else? So obviously draft policies and policies, yeah, guidelines, but what other kinds of documents would be interesting to capture the flavor of what happens at that deliberative level, that higher level? What else would you look at if you could get access, let's say in an ideal world? Emails or meeting minutes? Absolutely, yeah. Meeting minutes, very good, yeah. And we mentioned another source recently to capture the tone of the public, the mood of the public. What would you look at? The media, yeah. Okay, don't ignore the media. The media is actually very interesting. As long as you think about it as media, don't think about it as truth necessarily. But in some ways, even when we look at policies, always remember that at heart we should be, in policy research, we are constructivists at heart. So nothing is truth, okay? Everything is a version of truth or a version of reality, and you're trying to capture what underlies, what assumptions underlie the way a specific reality is presented, okay? So document mapping, review, we're going to talk about mapping actors and stakeholders, and then we're going to talk about a very specific type of interview that is often used in health policy work and also systems work. So you should be able to learn how to map relevant documents and actors that are pertinent to a topic, and we'll go back to our topics just to be consistent. We will be able to identify key informants for an HPSR study. You should be able to identify the difference between a regular interview and a key informant interview. And there's a lot of confusion about this, lots and lots of confusion. And you should also be able to identify and use strategies that will ensure a high quality key informant or elite interview. And we're going to talk about the difference between key informants and elite informants. Okay, so starting off with document mapping and review. Why documents? Yeah. This is, again, very constructivist point of view. A document is not just a piece of paper. Yeah. It is imbued with some kind of meaning, because the person who produced that document had an intention. Yeah, they had an intention. They're trying to convince you of something. They're trying to represent evidence in a certain way. And they're trying to inform a situation, or they have the intention to change a situation. Yeah? So it's not a standalone object, but it should be understood in the social web of meaning within which it's produced and consumed. Okay, so always think about what is the intent behind the document, and how is it expected, what consequences is it expected to have in terms of the target audience that it's for. So documents, both policy and non-policy, we generally review them for different reasons. We want to understand or describe the content or categorize the approaches. So do you remember when we talked about the differences between positivist research and descriptive positivist research? We said that you could do an analysis of a document simply by counting the number of words that refer to something. Okay, that's quite descriptive, because you are assuming that the more often a word is used or a term is used, the more important it is in the document. That's a kind of fairly basic analysis, is just literally running through documents with a search, a search function, and saying, count the number of times collaboration or partnership or words that are similar to that are mentioned, because that will help you locate in what ways partnership is being defined. What exactly do they mean by, in terms of a PPM? What exactly do they mean by partnership? Yeah? So you could search through those documents just by counting how often it's mentioned. You can also examine the implementation of health policies in real world settings. So you might not be looking at the policy document in that case, but you might be looking at guidelines, you might be looking at those meeting minutes, and you might, let's think of other things. There might be other kinds of documents that are used at the lower levels of the system, which are some kind of policy implementation guidelines. You're trying to situate policy agendas within specific contexts. Let's say a global policy comes in, so AMR policy, and you say, we actually know that this is being understood and implemented quite differently in different countries. And I was talking to Sakshi yesterday And she says it's implemented quite differently across different states in India as well, or sometimes not implemented at all yet. So what is the lag in terms of implementation of a common policy across the country? What explains the fact that in some states it gets quickly onto the implementation track, whereas in other states it's still at the stage of being formulated, right? The other thing is to analyze the policy process. So, where are we in the cycle? And you also do a document review because you might be commissioned to inform a new policy. And this is when people realize the policy is outdated, we have new technology, we've got better means of screening, better treatment regimens, so we actually need to inform the formulation of a new policy, which is going to improve whatever the situation is. So this is taken from a paper that was published a few years ago in Health Policy and Planning. And Health Policy and Planning is a journal you should be familiar with if you're interested in policy. It's a very, very good journal. And it basically has this nice series of articles from time to time, which are called How to Do or Not to Do. Yeah? So how to do or not to do a stakeholder analysis, how to do or not to do a document review, how to do or not to do some sort of method. So they, if you look it up, you'll find a very, very useful compilation and synthesis of literature on a specific method, usually pertinent to policy or systems research. And it also gives you tips, quite practical tips. So it's one of the few rubrics within this journal that is pragmatic, it's practical, yeah? So in terms of your documents, this is a bit standard, so forgive me, this is a little tiny bit boring, but you're going to ready your materials. So this seems obvious, but maybe it's not that obvious, because you need to be very clear about the boundaries. What is it that you're going to look at? Again, anything that you're going to get access to versus not access to is defining your universe of documents. And that universe might be quite restricted, simply because it is difficult to gain access to. You can gain access to the things that are published, yeah? You might even find Ministry of Health websites publish draft guidelines. But the ins and outs of what happened in these meetings and who was taught, who were the main people and how did the discussion take place, it's going to be more difficult. And often it's very sensitive, right? Because people don't really want to show you that actually very little evidence went into this policy, or very little discussion, or very little consensus was there. But basically, in an ideal world, if you really wanted to get at how did this policy get onto the agenda, you would love to have access to people's accounts or actually some documentation to show you the process. So you're going to set parameters around the nature and the number of documents that you plan to analyze based on your question. And now this obviously goes back to the questions that you all have set, because you've all set some macro level questions. So you might want to revisit your questions and think about the fact that your question you need to be able to answer the question with what is available, okay? Now obviously in your case, we're almost going for the optimal questions, the ideal case scenario. Are you really going to be able to access funding allocation or budgets for XYZ? Probably not. But I want you to keep that at the back of your mind, that when you formulate a question at the macro level, be aware that it's going to be constrained by the number of documents you can that are publicly accessible or accessible to you through whatever connections you have, and the kinds of interviews you might be able to conduct. So conducting research at this level can be more difficult than conducting it within the system or within the community, simply because people at that level are often make themselves a bit scarce, or they're simply busy, right? But back to the documents. So you need to think about how much time you're going to allocate to the document analysis and what's the scope of your research question. So time is an important issue because we often, in any research project, we all include something that says document analysis because we want to familiarize ourselves with the topic. But actually, if you do too quick and dirty a job of it, you don't really get much out of it. It's actually a fairly dull exercise. So in a lot of the projects that I've been involved in, we have included something, a research objective, which is to create a policy timeline of the evolution of XYZ policy in XYZ country. Yeah. So for example, the recent work in Uganda was trying to understand and compare the way the country had implemented policies for infection prevention control in the case of multiple recurrent epidemics. So not just COVID, but Ebola, and prior to that, HIV, and now, of course, there's other epidemics going on. So Uganda is a country that often experiences epidemics and endemics. And so what we were trying to understand is the country, the response in terms of infection prevention control, are they learning from previous epidemics? Yeah? And in order to do that, we needed to first use documents to create a timeline to see how is IPC conceptualized, what spheres does it cover? Is it mainly looking at health facilities or is it looking at communities as well? Who seem to be the main actors and does that change? How much funding is allocated over time and does that change? So we were looking at trends, yeah? So that's where the timeline idea came in. But actually the exercise turned out to be much more time-consuming than we expected, because it wasn't just a question of putting down dates and creating a timeline. It was actually trying to understand the discursive shift. And by discourse, I mean the ways in which IPC is conceptualized discursively. So discourse means in terms of how people give meaning to certain concepts. Okay, and you can imagine IPC for HIV looks quite different than IPC for COVID, because COVID was a global pandemic. HIV was global too, but it also had very specific national level policies, especially in countries that were extremely high burden, like Uganda. Okay, so you're thinking about the time you have available, and you have to be realistic and maybe trim down the question. Because if you think, okay, my first phase, first 6 months of my project, I'm going to do some review of documents. Just be clear what you want out of that document review. And then you need to establish criteria around the specific topic that you're investigating. So creating a policy timeline is a descriptive activity, but in terms of the actual thing that you want to extract from the documents, please do not be vague, okay? So I want to understand how, in two of your topics, you're actually looking at collaborations, right? You're looking at PPM as a collaboration across sectors. CHO is an integration of a health worker that has to sort of interact with the rest of the health workforce. So you might say, I want to understand the extent to which policy documents, how do they reflect, represent, and conceptualize the notion of integration or collaboration, yeah, or digital literacy, yeah? That already homes it down, because you know, I'm going to look at these documents and I'm going to see what exactly do they mean by digital literacy? What was intended, okay? And did that change depending on multiple iterations of the policy? So your topic, a particular policy, program, health issue narrowly defined. And the second is dates of inclusion. Now this is important, right? In Uganda, it was important for us to go all the way back to the 90s, because we wanted to see how the notion of IPC had changed depending on the epidemic that was of most importance or significance at the time. But you might say, my timeline is much shorter. The digitalization issue has only been around for X years, and therefore my timeline is just the last health policy period. I'm not sure if that's the case, whether it's 10 years or 5 years. But you think about the time period, that should be specific to your topic. And then you also, in terms of planning, is you start to make a list of places where you are going to locate those documents, because that is going to determine the validity of your question. If you realize that you can't actually access most of the things you'd like to access, put it aside. Think of something else that you can do, okay? So one of the things we wanted to do in Uganda was we wanted to understand how public perceptions of personal protective measures were changing. And we realized that they archived a few major national newspapers, but we realized that we had allocated far too little time. So by the time the person had located that there were 4,000 plus articles, we thought, no, this is an impossible task. It could be interesting, and there could have been a way to maybe, you could have divided it into time periods and then selectively chosen some. But we just didn't end up doing that. So I think, always this reality check. Does it match to the topic? Is it giving me something specific? And can I do it? Is it feasible within the time period? Okay, so this is taken from the article, and this just actually gives you a list of different types of documents that you might use. So official documents, and they tell you, what counts as those official documents, implementation documents, legal documents, working documents, scholarly work, media and communications, and other. Now, this is kind of interesting. Why do you think scholarly work is there? Because you might say, that's not really a policy document. Why do they put scholarly work there? So scholarly work refers to published literature, right? Why would you include published literature in a policy review? Yeah.
Published literature has the primary work done using primary data, where the researchers have gone in the field and collected the data, studied the data, and mainly it has policy recommendations based on the analysis of the data. So
okay, good. Okay. So can you formulate a question for me that asks exactly that, but asks it in a neutral way, rather than assuming that research informs policy? Anyone? How would you ask that question? Yeah, go ahead. Let me ask it this way. Do you think all research informs policy? Do you think all policy is evidence-based?
No.
Okay. So that's an assumption. So how do you phrase it as a question?
Yes. Like, is this result could be made as a policy?
Say it again, is the results what?
Is the research can be made it as a policy? Like, some research is done already. Like, and there are some results in our entrance I got from the student.
Yeah.
Now we can think that can we make it as a policy? Like, can we new policy, or can we add something to the existing policy?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, good. I agree.
Also, adding on to what she said that research delves into primary data and how was policy perceived at the grassroots level, and then with that evidence, sometimes policies are informed. So when we're asking a question in a neutral way, maybe we can frame it in a sense that how does the community respond to an X policy?
Okay, we're not talking about the community now. So my question to you was, why, if you're a policy researcher, would you be interested in published research? Not a policy document, it's published academic research. So normally that's part of your background, right? But I'm saying it is a form of data in this case. Why is it a form of data? Okay, think about what Solomon referred to, forms of evidence. What kind of evidence is this? Okay. Okay. In the best case scenario, we would hope that policies are evidence-based. Okay? And evidence comes through, ideally, rigorous, robust research. All right? So the question is, can I review research to see the extent to which my topic Yeah, my topic, whatever it is, PPM effectiveness or digitalization. To what extent does research on the topic feed into policy? Okay? So it becomes a different exercise than doing a literature review, because you are very specifically looking at who commissioned the research, why did they commission it, and were the results taken into account at all, especially if they were major studies, were those published results taken into account in those policy documents? Okay? Because in an ideal world, we would hope that research informs policy. We know that it doesn't all the time, not necessarily, but you need to consider that as one form of evidence that may or may not have played a factor. So when we did the study on decentralized care in South Africa, we not only interviewed people who were important and influential at the level of government or NGOs like MSF, but we also interviewed researchers, academic researchers, who were associated with specific papers that had proven, that had shown, yes, you can decentralize DRTB care. You don't have to do it at a highly specialized level. We have done a trial to show you that a nurse is able to deliver this care. So we wanted to know, did that evidence from those trials, from that academic research, have any place in the actual policy formulation? Okay? All right, so that's why you have scholarly work over here. Okay? Media and communications, again, different types of media and communications. You can probably, I can barely see this on my screen, but you can probably see it a bit better. Something else which I find interesting, textbooks and other course materials or training materials. Okay, let's pretend we are a policy researcher and we want to review medical textbooks. In what kind of situation might I be interested in the content and the curricula of medical education? What would that shed light on for me? Yeah?
How well it has been translated from the guidelines to distributed at the level of consideration?
Okay. Yes, could be. Could be. How well it's implemented? Okay. Up to guidelines. Okay, but which policy are we talking about? What kind of policy here? I want to review medical textbooks. I want to review the curriculum. Okay. I want to choose a time period. When were textbooks for medical education in India last revised? I don't know when they were last revised. But what am I interested in? What's my policy question?
To what extent the textbook has taken the new curriculum?
Good.
Like if it is a CBME curriculum is there.
Yeah.
So whether the textbook reflects that curriculum or not.
Very good. Okay. So the issue is that you might be interested in changing policies on medical education, right? And you might say, your hypothesis might be, is that the way that medicine is being taught in low and middle income countries is not meeting the needs of the country. So I had a PhD student who did this in Nigeria. And he basically was starting from the argument that in Nigeria, especially at the time that he was doing the PhD, there was a severe problem of brain drain. So all the medical doctors were primed up on high-tech medicine because they were all primed to leave the country and work in the US or the UK. Okay? So he looked at, and he did some interviews to assess to what extent the quality of medical education and the actual curriculum was suited to doctors serving in their own country, which it wasn't. So in fact, the whole medical education system, plus the family support system, plus the whatever other structures, was pushing these guys to leave the country. So it's very interesting. It was an interesting topic. I also did a PhD examination of AIMS, the institution that you're from, in Delhi, which was about socialization of medical doctors in AIMS. And it was again about it was a very excellent study. I think she published a book which would be really interesting. Her name is Anna Ruddock. And she was looking at the policies on selection of medical students. And so she was looking at the criteria and how the criteria had been changing across the country for entry to medical schools. So she was also looking at, selection criteria, the examination system, the curricula, what happened at each stage. And she was reviewing, things that were where you might think, well, this isn't really policy analysis, okay? So think creatively, yeah? Always think creatively. Think about the full range of documents that are going to shed light on policy, and in a broader sense, it's on politics, isn't it? Policy as politics in some way, because it signifies a kind of political change or shift in terms of how we're looking at a particular theme. Your second step is you're going to, now that you have your time plan, okay, you've decided on this is my time period, this is my available documents, and this is my question. That's very important. Your second thing is you're going to have to come up with some idea of how you're going to extract data, okay? Because you are treating a policy document or a research paper as a form of data. So this is very different than summarizing them. You're actually looking at it and you are thinking about it in the same way as you would an interview, a transcript, yeah? So the method of data extraction really depends on the research question, whether it's descriptive, explanatory, and also the nature of your documents. So for example, often what is commonly used is some kind of spreadsheet, like an Excel sheet, where each row is a document and each column has a category of information that you would like to extract. But this assumes what? This assumes that you have already some idea, some theoretical idea about what it is you want. It has some assumption about what different aspects of the document, what different content is going to reveal to you about changes in medical education or, key actors in terms of shaping decision-making or key events or whatever it is, yeah? But your question is operationalized and dictates the columns, the material that you're actually going to extract systematically from the documents. You can also import documents into common thematic coding software like Atlas TI or NVivo or whatever they're called. You can do that. I personally am not a fan, somehow. It's because I'm old school, right? Probably generation-wise. I still, when I used to have to code any kind of document or transcript, I still used to use highlighters, Post-its, cut the thing up, move it around, because it felt like I was more immersed in the analysis. I think that the more we use technological support, including our move towards AI, the less capable we are ourselves of being able to do things in a way that is deep or thoughtful. Okay, that's just my, my rant for the day. If the research questions focus on process, you can use the documents, as I said, to compile a timeline or to trace processes across time. What is also very interesting to do in a policy analysis is to understand, for example, if it's a comparative analysis, is that you might have some kind of flow chart. So what were the main factors affecting decisions, that led from X to Y? And you might be comparing kind of a decision flow, whatever, decision-making flow chart or something. How can you organize the data in the most coherent manner? What are your priority categories? Because you don't want to have too many columns, otherwise it becomes unwieldy, okay? So it's always a balance, like it is for any kind of qualitative analysis. It's a balance between too narrow and too broad categories. This is why the conceptual framework is very helpful, because I've been telling some of you, you've got to club these things together. You've got to club them, consolidate them, or chuck them out, yeah, because they're less relevant. And the third thing is you're going to analyze the data. So obviously data collection and analysis are iterative. So you start, it's that cycle, again, the research cycle, whereby you start to look at the findings, you're starting to eyeball your table, just like you would in quantitative analysis. You're starting to see trends and patterns are starting to emerge. And the same thing happens when you do this kind of analysis, is you're going to see things that lead you to other things and will inform, where you obtain further data and how you interpret it. So you're starting to analyze data. Often you're annotating, you're making notes on initial theories, and you're potentially modifying the document selection criteria. Because, for example, you read a document and you realize that when we did the work on the decentralization work, we realized that the most important actor pushing decentralized care was not a government actor, it was an NGO. It was MSF, which is Médecins Sans Frontières. So they were so active in one province of South Africa in terms of pushing innovative models of integrated care, decentralized care. And because one of them was very good friends with somebody else, they actually came somehow into the policy-making sphere, which was quite interesting, in one state, not necessarily in another, in one province. Okay, so when you look at individual documents, you might be assessing different things. So I explained that one thing is using an Excel sheet, but the first thing you might be doing before you do the Excel sheet is you look at each document and you try to summarize. Who was it written for? What was the purpose? Yeah? What was the context of this? Okay, it was written at a time when everybody was uncertain, or it was written at a time when the epidemic was in full-blown phase, and therefore, the tone is quite different, sense of urgency. So what's the motivation? What was the agenda? Who was involved? Always check who's behind the document, who is mentioned more frequently. How are the issues being framed? And what is the use of sources and evidence? So this is what I would call a descriptive summary for each document that you include. Okay, this actually comes before the extraction, the matrix. Okay, so overall, I think it's important when you describe the methodology for this document review is that you make some notes. How easy or difficult is it to locate these documents? Because later somebody might say to you, oh, but you completely missed out X, Y, Z. And then you can say, yes, but it was impossible to get a hold of that. So you are already in the process, you're already safeguarding yourself because you're noting the limitations of what you can and can't do. Yeah? Which voices and perspectives are represented? Which ones are missing? So for example, the student I had some years ago, Solomon knows her, she did some work on the uptake of pentavalent vaccine in India. She was looking at the policy-making process. And we knew that there was a big lobby, anti-vaccine lobby in India at the time. I don't think she adequately captured those perspectives, simply because it was difficult for her to get them on board, because by this time the thing had already been launched and they sort of faded slightly in terms of their importance. And I think people weren't willing to speak so much about it, okay? Even though it was very important at the time. So you need to acknowledge that. How complete is the set of documents? What's missing? You're also comparing, as I said, content, style, format, how long are they? What's the tone? Is the tone directive, telling people what to do? Is it consultative? Is it responding in a kind of, how do you say, defensive way? Yeah, you get a sense of that. Is visual information used, and how is it being used, okay? So we're always thinking about the use of evidence. So documents that have a lot of quantitative tables or graphs, or always think, put your critical hat on, yeah? Because don't just accept and swallow things as, okay, this is evidence, this must be true. Look at the graph, look at it carefully. What is it trying to tell you? What argument is it trying to make? How is it supporting what the document is telling you, okay? Any difference in framing and interactions are also interesting, okay? Because then you get a sense of the network. Who is colluding with who and who's conflicting with whom? Because the documents may cross-reference other actors. And then there's differences in how specific topics are addressed across levels or types of documentation. So for example, if you're looking at policy documents, the policy on medical education is looking very good, but when you look at the textbooks, they haven't really evolved, yeah? Versus the perception, the media perception of medical education in the country is quite negative. Okay, so you might have a mismatch which you need to try to explain. The fourth step is to distill your findings, and the question for you might be, where do you stop? Yeah, I think that's why the plan in the beginning is very important, is clarify upfront what you think you're going to be able to do within what time frame. Usually you have, you try to recognize early on what kinds of documents are relevant to my topic, and have I adequately touched on all those types of documents. Sometimes it's saturation, because to be honest, it's sometimes extremely boring to go through multiple government documents. They're not exciting reading. So you will notice that some of them are saying the same thing. So that's called saturation, right? Time issues, obviously. You synthesize findings, you might use some descriptive visuals, as I said, timelines, graphs, or actor mapping. We're going to talk about actor mapping in a minute. You might group your results just like you would with qualitative data according to themes. You might present your results as a narrative or a policy brief. So when Solomon, Abai, and I worked on the same programs that were funded through the British government, we were often requested to develop kind of short and punchy policy briefs based on the work that we had done on the private-public sector involvement in TB control or on integration of care. So people are less interested in a classical, here's my 30-page paper. They want to see something that's 2 pages, crisp, and that's interesting, right? And you also want to validate your findings against other methods, because what's in the document might be quite different than if you actually interview the Minister of Transport or whatever, right? Good. So we are not going to do this now. We're going to come back to this. This is an exercise that we'll come back to. But we're going to move straight to what's known as actor mapping. So now we're moving away from documents, but actually the documents have already given us some clue about the relevant actors, because they're authors of the documents, or because they're mentioned, or you have some sort of organogram, or whatever it is. Yeah. So actor mapping is simply a visual depiction of key organizations or individuals that make up a system, including those who are directly affected by it, as well as those whose actions influence the system. So in some ways, your conceptual framework is also going to help you with that. Because you're going to look at it and you're going to say, okay, who's the actor behind this? Have I only got ashas, or are there other things that are important? Because if I'm looking at my meso and my macro levels, there are other people, other actors, or structures that have bearing on what's happening in terms of their digital literacy capacity. So how does actor mapping support systems, mapping support systems thinking, including an HPSR? Because it gives you a good sense of the context. It allows you to explore connections. Connections are often not neutral. Yeah, the connections might be friendly connections, they might be conflictual or contrasting connections, and so on. They might give you a sense of information flows, who communicates with whom about what, yeah? They might help you determine where is the hub of power. On paper, there might be a sense of consensus across a broad range of actors, but once you've done the analysis, you realize that most of the decision-making takes place, at this level. And it also helps you gain a sense of contrasting perspectives. So this is an example, a stakeholder map for climate change and health in England. So at the time of writing this paper, I think it is from around 2 or 3 years ago, 2021, the public health landscape in England is undergoing significant change with the announcement that Public Health England will be removed and the roles divided between existing and new organizations. In particular, the new UK Health Security Agency will take over responsibility. So this is a simple kind of organogram, but it is mapping out the relevant bodies, regulatory, advocacy, education, and others, to this topic of what's happening and who is relevant for making important decisions in this climate and health space. Okay, so how do you identify key actors and stakeholders? Usually your documents are your starting point, okay, but I'm assuming because you're interested in the topic is you already have an idea of who the key people might be. You might have identified them from the literature because you realize they are prolific in terms of writing about the topic, or from the organizations that the literature represents, or, as I said, from your document review. So strategic plans, evaluation reports, etc. That's the core of your map. But you want to expand the map beyond what you know at the outset of the study, which is often limited. So which people or places do core stakeholders interact with on a regular basis? Which organizations are supporting or influencing those who are interacting at the core? Which ones are holding opposing or alternative perspectives? Very important to make sure you take account of them. What types of local, regional, national, or international organizations influence the core's experience? Who is funding these people? Who is conducting relevant research, and who actually sets policy? So these are all just examples of prompts. Yeah? Okay, so we're going to push on for another 25 minutes or so, and then we're going to move in the afternoon into an exercise that covers some of these things. So you have done your document review, you have identified some important actors, and you've tried to map them in terms of their influence on your topic. Now you're going to go out and do your study. Yeah? So how, beyond document mapping, you're going to be doing some interviews. And what you may have already, you might be familiar already with a key informant interview or an elite interview. Let me ask you, why does a key, or what do you think, what does it sound like? What does key sound like? A key is something that opens a door, right? So what's the difference between a normal interview and a key informant interview? What do you think? Is there a difference? Let me put it this way. Okay, why is there a difference?
A key informant is the one who is the holder of the information in that particular setting. Mm-hmm. It is different from the normal interview because whatever information we want to extract from the key informant is not available with the local person available over there. So they basically opens the door for us to inquire certain topic, mm-hmm. Of which they had information rather than the other person who can give inputs on the same information.
Okay. What characterizes a key informant in contrast to a regular informant? You said that they offer an entry point. Why do they offer an entry point? Why are they different from a general informant?
In the key informant interview, we are going to get, it's not for it is not only restricted to or can be used to the, the providers are not for those who are using the whatever is going on healthcare. We can get the perspective of both the side, and also the word key means it's something what we are going to unlock. Mm-hmm. It's not like a general interview, we will go round, again come to the point. It's not like that. Here it's like key informant may be a semi-structured questionnaire or something like that. We are going to take something which we actually want from that particular person. Mm-hmm. That's what the key information makes sense to that. It will add some strength to our, previously we did 2 exercises, what is called Like we are going to, like first we'll go through the documents, then we'll, from the documents, we are going to find the key, like stakeholders. So from the stakeholders, we move beyond that. We want to know what exactly is going on for to
Okay.
extract that, to elicit that we can do this.
Okay, sort of on the right track, but not quite. Okay, so I'm going to ask you it differently. Go ahead.
He is the representative of a particular community whom the researcher can interview to understand the views of the community he is representing.
Okay, okay. All right, let me give you an example. Let's say you want to understand, the relationship between traditional birth attendants and state-sanctioned, whatever it is, auxiliary nurse midwives. Okay? Who might be a key informant in a study that is looking at the relationship between these two types of birth attendants? Mothers? Okay, do you agree? You're allowed to say it depends. Okay. Any idea? Okay, the study is about midwives, yeah? Traditional birth attendants, community-based midwives, and facility-based midwives. Is a community-based midwife, could they be a key informant? Okay, why or how?
It depends on the type of question we are probing. If you are probing them for how do they function, so they are the best one who can tell us about their story or how they actually function in the system. And we can compare it to the ALMs as if how do they function. So they both are the one.
Okay, so that's the clue. You're giving me a clue here. It is they are the best people to give me information on how something functions. Okay? Probably lots of midwives could do that for you. So what is special about the key informant midwife?
The one who is practicing it for a long period of time,
Yeah.
the one will be the key informant for this business.
Okay, good. So it has something to do with the length of experience, the specialized knowledge, yeah? And maybe does seniority have something to do with it? Should I be choosing a key informant because they're positioned high up in the hierarchy? What do you think? Is it better for my key informant study for me to go to the senior A&M in the facility versus a more junior one? It depends, right? Absolutely, it depends, okay? Okay, so what I'm trying to say to you is don't assume that leadership or hierarchy is naturally associated with being a key informant, okay? Because sometimes that leads us to a very tricky situation. We think that just because somebody is a designated leader or a designated superior in terms of the system, that they're going to be a key informant. But now imagine this situation. I'm going into health facilities and I want to understand how managerial practices around a specific topic are influencing people's motivation to follow some sort of guidelines. And I say, okay, who's my key informant? Of course, I go straight to the clinic managers. Go to the clinic managers. This situation happened to us. And we found that some of the clinic managers are absent most of the time. Okay, so we have facility managers with a high level of absenteeism. Why? Because they're gone on trainings or they're doing their private practice or whatever it is. So they're not ideal key informants because they don't actually know very well. They know how things are supposed to run on paper, but they're not really so informed on the in and out, the runnings of the clinic. Okay? So don't assume hierarchy or leadership translates into a key informant. Don't assume that. Let's look at what they are. Key informants are people who can unlock information for you about a specific issue. And they're usually specialized in terms of their in-depth knowledge, their familiarity, or their experience on a topic of interest. So when I was asking you about the A&Ms, we're not necessarily looking for a senior A&M. We're looking for somebody who has a lot of experience. But what else? We're looking for somebody who's willing to talk about their experience. Because a key informant interview, you're going to see, is very different from a normal interview. It is a dialogue. It is not a classical interview. It is really a dialogue where you yourself have to be aware of your positioning. But it is not the question answer that we're familiar with in terms of a normal interview. Yeah? That key informant that is selected should be able to provide what's known as a broad interview overview, so a bird's eye perspective, but also specific detail. Now, a bird's eye perspective means that they're capable of a certain level of abstraction. Okay? And sometimes it's difficult to find people with that analytical capacity. But a really good key informant is somebody who has analytical thinking. They're able to analyze trends. They're able to tell you what has changed, why things are the way they are. And they're able to look at structures within the system that they're operating and tell you more about, interrelationships or dynamics or whatever. So they are specialized in terms of their area of expertise. They are experienced, but they also have this level of thinking, which is slightly different. Very often, we don't just speak to them in the beginning of the study, but we try to come back to them over the course of the study. Why? Because our ideas change. And you want to go back and you say, look, I've done my survey and I'm finding some really strange trends. Can you comment on this? Do you think this is unusual? So it's nice if you can go back to them, right? It's also often somebody who can help you with further context. So in the beginning, you might have an idea. I've got some 5-6 key informants. These are people who I think will be helpful, but very often we ask them, we say, is there anybody else you think that can provide this kind of level of detail or overview? When do you interview them? You interview them when you need inside knowledge about a policy, a process, an outcome. And when the knowledge about the topic is not accessible to the public. It's privileged knowledge, okay? It's privileged because they hold it in their way of doing things or their way of thinking or whatever. And often you also do it when there's not that much time and you need to get immersed into a topic fairly quickly. You can use it at the outset of a study in an exploratory way because you're exploring the field, but you can also use it to gain depth. So there's nothing wrong with doing key informant interviews later in your topic to gain some kind of historical context or ability. Let's say you did the document review, you did your timeline, and now you want to go to the key informants to represent specific eras. So you go and speak to some retired people, people who are important in the government. Retired people are excellent to talk to. Why? Because they have shed all the worries about the power dynamics. If you talk to the current minister, he's going to be very uptight. He's not going to give you a lot of information. You talk to a retired minister, oh my God, they will tell you everything and anything. So you're also trying to gain breadth and perspective through different kinds of positions and multiplicity of knowledge. So we generally talk about 3 types of knowledge that we're gaining in a key informant interview. The first is technical knowledge, because let's assume you are looking at a new technology and you're trying to understand, we mentioned the example of Gene Expert, but let's imagine we're even further along with some diagnostic technology. And you are a lay person, you don't really understand much about how the technology works or how it's going to be implemented. So you need a key informant who's going to break it down for you very clearly. What does this technology involve? What is the infrastructure required? What kind of equipment does it look like physically? Where is it going to go? So you want technical knowledge. You're exploring that area. What does implementation of this new diagnostic screening machine, how is it going to impact on the health system? And the first thing you want to know is what is it? If you don't know much about the thing itself and what it's meant to do, it's not a good starting point, right? So you want to explore that technical knowledge. The second is process knowledge. And process knowledge is about understanding how processes are standardized or formalized and put into place in such a way that is intended to whatever it is, improve workflows or improve the structure of care or the organization of care. So your next informant in terms of the screening machine would be somebody who tells you about how it's being implemented in the facilities. And they're going to explain to you the process, the algorithm. What is it being used for? When is it being used for? What is the decision-making flow? Yeah? And the third one is your key informant, who might be able to give you knowledge on why things are happening the way they are. So it's a higher level person who has a good oversight. They have been overseeing or they're responsible for rollout of this technology in multiple districts or multiple states in the country. And they are going to give you some insights into why it seems to be more acceptable in some places than others. Why is the uptake better in some places than others? Why is the budgeting, whatever the question is. Now, you might be saying, do I need separate key informants for each of these? Or are there key informants who might be able to help with, the first two types of knowledge versus the last or whatever? Of course. Your key informant topic guide can include questions about the three of this, but obviously sometimes for technical knowledge, the person is quite different than very often they're completely different, because the technical person is so hyped up about their technology that they're not really thinking about implementation that much. Right? Okay, so as I said, what type of knowledge? Technical, specific knowledge in the field, often details on operation, laws, etc. Process is about the routines, the interactions. The expert has knowledge as she or he is directly involved in this. And the explanatory is their interpretation of the rules, their interpretation of the relevance, their interpretation of what's happening and why it's not happening. Also reveals things like their own ideologies, inconsistencies in ideologies. And the interview, him or herself and his routines are the focus of the interview. Okay? In this case, the technical knowledge, you're not really asking, and what do you think about this screening machine? No, you're not asking about that. You're asking them, what is this machine? What does it do? You're not asking their opinion about it. Yeah? Versus here, you're much more focused on the informant. So you have been involved in this nationwide program to improve screening of cancer, cancer. Tell me about what you think. Did the implementation of this machine make a difference? Why or why not? You're asking their opinion versus the first one where you were just asking the technical, what is this? How is it going to work? Okay? Any questions on that? No, okay. So the next question is how many informants? It really depends on the purpose of the interview. Are you exploring? Are you trying to explain? It depends on your mapping of actors, relevant actors, because you might need to explore contradictory positions. It depends on, are you able to access them? You might have a lovely wish list of 20 key informants, but actually access is going to be only feasible for half of them. The timing, do you want to have a study where you come back to them regularly? The scale of the study. And I personally, whenever I see a key informant study with 200 interviews, I say, I'm sorry, sir, or madam, that is not a key informant study. Okay, because it's a key informant interview is very big. It's a big interview. So I usually look at, for small studies, 8 to 10, maximally 12. And for bigger studies, kind of anywhere in the range of 20 to 25. Okay, so this is just an example. Study from South Africa many years ago. This was about integrating SRH and HIV services as an important policy concern, especially in high prevalence HIV prevalence settings. Obviously, you know this, history of vertical program resulted in SRH being handled differently from HIV. And they had a lot of challenges to integrate care in South Africa. So they interviewed 21 key informants. There you can see the types of key informants. They used purposive selection and snowball sampling, which means they asked people about other people they should interview. And they basically sampled to redundancy, which is effectively something like saturation. Semi-structured topic guide. And the interviews were face-to-face or telephonic, audio recorded or transcribed. And here you can see a little bit the results that they came about. They looked at policy and systems challenges, service challenges that resulted in, this is another conceptual framework, by the way. Not a brilliant one, I have to say. It's too many things clubbed, too many things in the things, but essentially they were looking at why there's a failure to integrate, right? But they're also looking at opportunities to improve the situation, okay? Now before we close, let's talk about one more type of key informant. So sometimes you have a key informant who holds, and in this case it is an issue of power or authority. They're a recognized powerful person. And they're usually a lead representative of an organization or a profession or a decision-making structure. So they're on the top of the organogram. And they can be responsible overall for the development, the implementation, or the control of the particular intervention or the strategies you're interested in. They have privileged access to information about groups of people or decision processes. And the reason why we are doing this is an exercise that Solomon will do with you, I think on Monday, which is that when you start to map the actors and how they're connected, you realize that some actors seem to be more important than others. Yeah, they're the kind of elites in terms of that all information flows via them. Yeah, so this is some sort of network analysis, and there are quantitative techniques to do network analysis, but we're doing it in a kind of much simpler way. We're trying to understand the relative weight, power, and influence of specific actors versus others. So who are these experts? They have high insight in aggregate or specific knowledge. They know a lot about processes, behavior, strategies. The information is difficult to explore through other methods. They're often part of a network. In fact, they're often at the center of the network. They can lead to other interviews. They're often highly motivated. So whenever I've had to conduct expert interviews, they know they're experts, right? They're very happy to speak to you, usually. Okay, now we're gonna talk about something else which is very interesting, which is your role in a key informant interview or an elite interview. Because it's a special kind of interview, it is challenging if you have limited knowledge about the topic, because you're dealing with somebody who is important or thinks they're very important, and he's going to tell you, I've got exactly 10 minutes. What do you want to know? Yeah? Or they're going to basically tell you what you already know. Yeah, because somebody at that level, you would have read the policy documents and you say, okay, so I've read this, and they will just spit out exactly the same thing as in the documents because they're bound by certain rules. So they work for some organization like WHO or whatever ministry, and they're not really allowed to go outside of that, okay? Or you have the awkward situation, which is, okay, if you don't mind, I'm tape recording this interview, tape record. Very dull interview, everything. Okay, now turn the tape recorder off. Okay, now I'll tell you what the truth is. Now I'll tell you what the real story is. That happens all the time. Is that people will talk off the record and they will happily share. And then you're like, what do I do now? According to ethics, I'm not allowed to take this into account. So I think you've got to make that very clear. And we'll go into ethics and ethical strategies in HPSR in, I think, middle of next week. You've got to make clear how you're going to handle that kind of situation. Do you still use that information? If so, how do you use it? How do you inform the person that you nonetheless, despite the fact that they switched the recorder off, what are you going to do with it? All right? So this happens quite a lot. So let's think about what your role is. So there are 4 potential roles that you have as an interviewer. Sometimes you are a so-called co-expert. Yeah? So that means you are yourself, let's say you're a researcher, let's say Solomon, okay, not Solomon, but let's say that you are somebody who is a researcher who's been working on, you know, looking at comparing effectiveness of different screening technologies for a long time. And you're interviewing somebody who has come up with a new screening technology, which is a bit controversial. but you already are quite, you're pretty good in your field, right? They know you're good in your field. So it's like and like, yeah? So you're both rubbing each other's backs, yeah? Your knowledge level is comparable. The communication is symmetrical because there's an acknowledgement side, either explicit, oh, hello, doctor, yes, a doctor, so-and-so. I mean, all that social stuff that goes on when people acknowledge subtly or unsubtly acknowledge that they're on the same level. The interviewer knows the terminology in the field, so the style of questioning is much more open. It's like a dialogue, and the interviewer plays an active role because they're able to direct the conversation in a way that is really picking up. They understand the topic. So when we were doing this work in South Africa, one of the interviewers was himself a medic who had worked in TB care for a very long time. So when you compare those interviews with other interviews where the person was a lay person, didn't know the field very well, very, very different. I'm not saying one was better or worse, okay? But the person who was already an expert in the field took a lot for granted. So they just went straight to the technicalities that they knew about, or they mentioned names that they knew about. So obviously it has an advantage. Very good level of discussion, information generation. You get past all the superficial stuff, less issues with balancing power dynamics. Now, what is the disadvantage? Is that you're going to stay within your framework of the field of expertise. It tends to be over-focused on technical detail and lacking broader context. Why? Because these are two experts talking to each other. So they're going to be like, oh yeah, what did you think about, when they added this, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, for an outsider, this is completely irrelevant to our broader topic, right? Okay, now you have the opposite situation. Complete lay person. The interviewer has a low level of knowledge of the field. The communication is going to be asymmetrical. The interviewee may dominate. So you're facing somebody who's going to assert themselves because they realize that they're the ones in charge here. And the interviewer has a perceived lower status. So the interviewer ends up asking fairly broad questions because they don't know the field well enough, which generate long answers or generate answers which you could basically gain from the policy documents already. Yeah? So the advantages are the interviewees have a high level of confidence. They may be at ease with this position, and they're under pressure to explain. So sometimes there is an advantage if you're a lay person, because you're allowed to ask the so-called dumb questions, right? So tell me how this machine actually works. Sorry, but I'm not from the field, so just explain it to me. And then, listening to that, you can say, but how is that going to work if the electricity is cut half the time? How are you going to do that? Oh, we put in a generator in place. Yeah, but does this facility actually have the financial capacity for the generator? So you can see how asking sort of simple questions might lead you down a track which allows you to ask questions that are about the broader context of implementing this technology, where the first two, the co-experts, just ended up talking about the technicalities of the thing, right? The disadvantages are that the interviewer may struggle to engage with the interviewee answers and can't guide, so they end up kind of reading off their sheet the whole time. Yeah, okay, oh yeah, sorry, question 3, yes, what did you think? And it ends up being, it's not a dialogue, right? It's just question, answer, yeah? So remember, key informant interview is a dialogue. It's not, it's very much guided by the responses. Okay, another type of role is an associate, where the interviewer and the interviewee share the same frame of thinking. The communication might focus on shared experience. The style is informal, and the relationship is collegial. Yeah, doesn't mean you're an expert, but you are kind of still at an equal level, even though your field might be different than this person. So the advantage is there's a high level of trust. You get access to confidential insider information because often you're, for example, working in DRTB care. So when you work in health systems and policy work, anyway, the field becomes smaller and smaller. So basically, if Solomon or Abai or I go to an HPSR conference, we kind of know half the people already, right? Which means we're all associates, right? There's a collegial kind of understanding, oh, we're all part of this little community, right? So Trust, you have access to confidential insider information. Why? Because they'll reference things like, oh, did you hear that so-and-so left WHO and they've now moved to London? Really? Is that true? So what happened? What's the story? Yeah, it was terrible. They were stuck in this position, they couldn't do this, and there was a huge fight between so-and-so and so-and-so. And so you're like, oh my God, yeah, I know that guy was, so you get into this whole kind of insider chat. Yeah? Not very professional, has to be said, but it happens because you're in the know. The disadvantage is it's a normative framework. The assumptions are not questioned. Confidentially shared information may actually present a breach of ethics. Yeah, if you start getting into chat. Yeah. Now your fourth position, an interesting position, is you're actually a critic. So the interviewer and interviewee have different views and frames of thinking. The communication may reflect this. The style of questioning tends to be a bit provocative. Okay, let's say you are talking about the topic of vaccines, uptake of vaccines, childhood vaccines, and you're going to have to interview somebody who represents the anti-vaxxer lobby. Yeah? So you're going to go into the interview, you have to stay very, very neutral, but some of the stuff that this person is telling you, you just are finding it very difficult to hold back. You know, are you aware that measles is killing so and so many? So you've got to hold back, right? Even though this person is saying, why? You know, we all had measles when we were young children. What's the big deal? It is self-immunity, natural immunity, et cetera, et cetera. So you really get that kind of views sometimes that you fundamentally disagree with. So the advantage is you're going to get somebody who's challenging the status quo. They're going to give you a very different perspective, and your job is to really understand the arguments that underpin their point of view. Yeah, it's an elaboration of the normative stance, and it's unpacking the assumptions that we would normally have around the normative stance. The disadvantages is the dialogue can be disrupted. The interviewer may compromise their position and their access to further informants because they end up in such a disagreement that the interview doesn't really go all that well. And I think I have been in situations like that where it becomes quite tense because you represent a certain view, they know you represent a certain institution, and so on. Okay, so I think we're going to stop there. I think our next session is going to be quite practical. We're going to go into conducting key informant interviews. I'm going to give you some tips around them. And then we're going to go into the exercise of mapping documents that are relevant to your topic, mapping actors that are relevant to your topic, and developing an actual key informant topic guide. So you're going to choose categories of people that are relevant for your topic, and you're going to come up with, individually, you're going to come up with some guides that you're going to exchange on. Okay, so we'll stop there.